You're sitting on the floor crying, the kind of crying you weren't planning on. And before you've said a word, before you've even reached for a tissue, your dog gets up from across the room and puts her head in your lap. You didn't call her, you didn't cue her. Something in you changed and she moved. The question is, what actually happened in that moment? Did she understand that you were sad? Or did something simpler happen, something closer to a smell, a sound, a posture that triggered a response with no understanding behind it at all? Because there's a real difference between an animal that catches your emotion the way you catch a yawn and an animal that actually knows what's going on inside you. One of those is reflex, the other is something closer to a mind meeting another mind. And for a long time, scientists genuinely did not know which one we were looking at. Let's start with the word itself because it's doing a lot of hidden work. Emotional contagion is the simple version. One creature's distress spreads to another. Automatically, the way a baby in a nursery starts crying because another baby is crying with no real understanding of why. Empathy is the harder version, recognizing a specific emotional state in someone else as belonging to them and responding to it as theirs. A dog jumping into your lap because your sadness has made the room feel tense could be contagion. A dog specifically approaching a crying stranger, gently in a way clearly meant to soothe rather than to soothe itself, starts to look like something closer to real understanding. In 2012, two psychologists at Goldsmiths, University of London, Deborah Custance and Jennifer Mayer, decided to actually test it. They brought 18 pet dogs into their own homes and ran a simple, clever experiment. In one condition, the dog's owner pretended to cry. In another, a complete stranger pretended to cry. In a third, someone hummed in a strange, unfamiliar way, just to see if dogs were simply curious about odd behavior. In a fourth, someone just talked normally. Here's what happened. Almost every dog in the study approached the person who was crying, whether it was their own owner or a total stranger they'd met minutes earlier. Far fewer approached during the humming. None reacted to ordinary talking. And crucially, the dogs didn't just wander over and watch. Observers who didn't know which condition they were looking at described the dog's body language as submissive. Heads low, tails tucked, a soft, careful approach, the posture of an animal trying to comfort rather than confront. If the dogs had simply been seeking their own comfort, you'd expect them to run straight to their owner every time. They didn't. They went to whoever was crying, owner or stranger, as if the sadness itself, not the relationship, was what was pulling them in. That's remarkable, but Custance and Mayer themselves were careful, almost suspiciously careful. They pointed out that the dogs could simply have learned over a lifetime of living with people that approaching someone upset tends to get rewarded with affection, which means what looks like empathy could really be a very well-practiced habit, worn smooth over thousands of small interactions, none of which require the dog to understand sadness at all. Science doesn't get to skip that possibility just because the story is nicer without it. So let's leave dogs for a second and ask whether this shows up anywhere else, because if it's just a trained habit unique to one domesticated species, that tells us one thing. If it shows up independently in animals that have never lived with us and never needed our approval to survive, that tells us something very different. In 2014, a researcher named Joshua Plotnik, working with the primatologist Franz de Waal, studied 26 Asian elephants at a camp in Thailand. Elephants show distress in obvious ways. Ears flared, tail raised, low rumbling calls. Plotnik watched what happened when a nearby elephant witnessed one of its group in that state. Over and over, the nearby elephant approached and made physical contact, chirping and touching its trunk gently to the distressed elephant's face. Sometimes it went further. It put the tip of its trunk directly into the other elephant's mouth. That is an extraordinarily vulnerable thing to offer another animal. You could be bitten. Researchers describe it as something close to an elephant handshake handshake or an elephant hug, a physical signal that says unmistakably, I am here and I am not a threat. Consolation behavior like this had only been documented before in a small handful of species: the great apes, some canines, a few corvids. Elephants share none of those evolutionary branches closely, which means whatever is happening in an elephant's brain when it walks over and puts its trunk into a distressed companion's mouth evolved on a completely separate track from whatever's happening in a dog's brain when it rests its head on your knee. Two unrelated lineages arriving independently at the same instinct. Something's wrong here, and I should go be near it. Now here's where the story gets genuinely strange, because so far every example has involved one animal reading another animal. The real question is whether that same wiring can reach across the species line entirely. Whether an animal that isn't a primate, isn't a dog, has never lived in your house, can look at a human face and actually register what it's seeing. In 2016, researchers at the University of Sussex, led by Amy Smith and Karen McComb, tested 28 horses. They showed each horse a life-sized photograph of a man's face, either smiling or scowling in anger, with no other cues at all. No tone of voice, no body language, just a photograph. And the horses' heart rates climbed noticeably faster when they looked at the angry face than the happy one. On top of that, when viewing the angry photo, the horses tended to turn and look at it with their left eye specifically, a behavior linked in many species to the right hemisphere of the brain, the half that specializes in processing threat. A horse, in other words, looked at a still image of an emotion it had never smelled, never heard, never touched, and its body reacted as if something real was in the room. That result made headlines everywhere. It also almost immediately ran into a wall. Later that same year, a biologist named Tim Schmoll published a formal challenge to the study, arguing that some of the heart rate measurements were statistically shaky and that the functionally relevant conclusion wasn't as solid as it looked. Smith and her colleagues responded, defended most of their original findings, and the debate is still, honestly, not entirely settled, which is worth sitting with for a second because it tells you something true about this entire field. Even the most compelling result, the one that looks like undeniable proof an animal understood your emotion, is genuinely hard to nail down with total certainty. The wall between watching behavior and knowing what's behind it doesn't come down just because the data is good, it just moves. But maybe we've been looking for the wrong kind of evidence. Maybe the real proof isn't a single dramatic reaction to a single sad moment. Maybe it's something slower, quieter, and much harder to fake. In 2019, a team at Linköping University in Sweden, led by Ann-Sofie Sundman, studied 58 dogs and their owners, Shetland sheepdogs and border collies. Instead of watching a single interaction, they measured something called hair-cortisol concentration, essentially a chemical record of how stressed a body has been on average over the past several months. They tested each pair twice, once in summer and once in winter, and they found that a dog's long-term stress levels rose and fell in step with its owners, not because of one bad day, not because of a single fight or a single cry on the kitchen floor. Over an entire season, a dog's body was quietly tracking its owner's baseline emotional weather and drifting to match it. That's not a dog reacting to your tears. That's a dog's biology entangled with yours over months, in a way neither of you can consciously observe happening in real time. Nobody trained that. Nobody rewarded that. It's not a learned trick for getting affection. It's something closer to two nervous systems, quietly, involuntarily, syncing up over an entire year of shared life. Which brings us back to the floor, to the crying, to the dog dog who got up and crossed the room before you said a single word. Maybe what happened wasn't a single clean moment of her understanding your sadness the way another person would. Maybe it was something stranger and honestly a little more moving. A body that had spent years quietly tuning itself to yours, so that by the time you were crying, she didn't need to interpret anything at all. She'd already been carrying a little of it the whole time. You may never catch the exact instant it happens. There's no moment you can point to and say, there, that's when she started feeling what I feel. But the next time you're having a hard year, somewhere in her, quietly, without a single word passing between you, she might be having one too.